Good afternoon. My name is Tom Phillips, and I am a Senior United States District Judge for the Eastern District of Tennessee. This afternoon I have the honor and privilege of interviewing Don C. Stansberry, Jr. This interview is being conducted on Monday, August 28, 2017, in the Howard H. Baker, Jr. United States Courthouse in Knoxville, Tennessee. This interview is being conducted as a part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Don, if you would please, state for us your full name and relate the place of your birth.
I'm Don C. Stansberry, Jr. I was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, February the 7th, 1939.
Before we get into your legal career, Don, I would like to ask you some preliminary questions about your background to introduce you to our viewers. First of all, let's begin with the identity of your paternal and maternal grandparents.
Well, my father's father was A.H. Stansberry. His wife was Julia Gallion Stansberry. They lived on 15th Street where the UT Student Center is now, and that was a place I became first familiar with the University of Tennessee.
If you would please, state your father's name and where he was born.
My father was Don C. Stansberry, and he was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, and lived there on 15th Street.
And what was his occupation?
He worked at the Fulton Silfen Company. He was a factory worker.
Could you relate for us some of your father's community activities and interests?
Yeah, my father and my mother were both, mostly interested in their children, their education, their activities they would participate in. He was very active in the Bearden sports boosters clubs. He and a group of men built the first bleachers at Bearden High School when they began football in the 50s. He had a little league team later than that, did Boy Scouts, did Scout troops, just children's activities mostly.
And what was your mother's name and her place of birth?
Mother was Jean McDowell Stansberry. She was born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Her parents were Robert McDowell and Margaret Aiken McDowell. She was a school teacher. Can join my father in most of those similar activities.
Okay. If you would, Don, tell us where you grew up and tell us about your siblings.
Well, I grew up in Knoxville. Our home was where the offices of the Catholic Sacred Heart compound are there now. They bought our property and built those office buildings. We lived on the creek there. North Shore Drive then was a 2-lane highway, and where the Catholic Church is was a farm. Downstream were mostly vacant lots till you got to the corner. That's where I grew up. I had a brother younger than I, a sister a couple of years older than I was. And
okay, could you tell us about your recreational activities and any hobbies you developed while in your childhood?
Well, my dad was an avid fisherman and hunter, and I joined him in that as I was able. I'd go with him before I was big enough to fish or hunt, and later I was old enough, he gave me a gun and a fishing rod and let me paddle his boat mostly, but we did that a lot. We played ball. We engaged in just sports activities.
And where did you attend elementary and junior high school?
Went to the Bearden Elementary School. At the time, the building that is still the elementary school was had 12 grades all the way through high school. While I was there, they built what was to become my high school next door.
And you also went to Bearden High School?
I went to Bearden High School.
Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about your college days. I know that you went to the University of Tennessee, but tell us why you chose that particular school to attend.
It was the only option we had. My dad had worked for TVA before he worked at Fulton's. And my mother was determined that we would, quote, live in a college town, because she said one way or another we'll get these children through school if they got a place to live. So they moved to Knoxville, and he changed his job, and there was no option except we were all going to go to UT, and we did.
Did you have any teachers and or courses during college that were particularly significant for you?
Not that I can recall. College was an event to overcome if you could, graduate if you could, and I went on to law school as quickly as they would let me.
If you would, please relate for us any friends you developed during college and any extracurricular activities you participated during college.
Well, in law school, I guess one of the best things about it was the quality and the character of the people there. And I've continued to be friends all of my life with a lot of the people that we went to law school with. Bob Ritchie was a particular friend. He and I remained friends for the rest of his life, and did lots of different things together. I still know people I went to law school with. They're still friends. And I think that's one of the better things about a small law school. And I think most of us stayed in Tennessee, and so we ran into each other over the years for a long time.
Did you have any part-time or summer work experiences while you were in college?
Yeah, when I was in high school, I mowed people's yards. By the time I got to college, I had a variety of jobs. My father would find us some job every summer that made no issue of us going back to school. I worked for the State Highway Department a couple of summers, cutting brush for a survey crew. I worked to build a house, those kinds of activities. And we had a job every summer, and were able to, frankly, save enough money to pay a lot of our way through school.
Tom, would you relate for us any major social, economic, and or political events which had a significant impact on your early life?
Well, let's see. My early life, I started school in 45 and graduated from high school in 57. That transpires the era of Brown versus School Board. We were expected an integrated class when we went back to school that fall, and turned out that was going to be a long time to come, but none of us knew that. The 60s, as you know, brought civil rights issues and struggles, and Knoxville was, I thought, fairly fortunate in most of that. We lived through that. I guess those are the principal things. Other than that, it was a pretty prosperous time. It was a good time to grow up.
Now let's focus on your law school career. How did your interest in the law begin?
Well, I told you my dad worked in a factory. He had a brother who was a lawyer. Roy Stansberry was a colorful person, a character in a lot of people's minds, and certainly an interesting person for a young person to be around. And he was about the only relative I had that had a job that I thought I might like. My father told me to be a lawyer because that way you'd never have to work for anyone. Obviously, my father was never a lawyer. I think lawyers work for everybody. But it was interesting to me, and it was available to me, and frankly, I enjoyed law school and enjoyed taking that up as a profession.
And why did you choose the University of Tennessee Law School to attend?
Same answer. It was the only option I had. And I certainly didn't have any resistance to going to UT, but I never considered anywhere else to go.
And did you live on campus, or did you live at home?
Lived at home.
Lived at home. Okay.
We never.
Could you relate for us any professors that you particularly remember, and any courses that you particularly enjoyed while you were in law school?
Yeah, Colonel Harold Warner was probably every student's favorite person there, and he was certainly mine. Elvin Overton was a really renowned constitutional scholar, and we had excellent faculty, really. Dixon Noel was a recognized author on torts, and a really interesting person to have for a professor. So we had several remarkable people. I guess Colonel Warner would be my favorite. He was an authority on property law. There's not a lawyer around of my generation that doesn't know who he is or was.
You mentioned a few minutes ago one of your friends in law school was Bob Ritchie.
Yeah.
As I recall, it seems like he was first in your class and you were second. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct.
Oh.
I think I had better grades than Ritchie had. But I'd stand corrected if someone had a transcript.
Oh. Could you tell us about other friends that you had in law school?
Well, Charlie Gearheiser was a good friend. He later was a lawyer there in Chattanooga. Golly. Jimmy Jarvis, who was later a judge of this court. I'd known him in high school, but he was a friend in law school. Gene Eblin, who ended up being a judge down in Roane County, was a really good friend. Bob Finley was a prominent lawyer here in Knoxville. We had a very close relationship with a lot of what turned out to be really good lawyers.
Were you involved in any activities while you were in law school?
I was on the law review. I worked all the way through law school. That wasn't real popular with the law school faculty. They sort of thought you ought to go to school or you ought to work, but not do both. My family and later my wife thought I should work, so I did. But I was on the law review and participated in moot court and those kinds of things.
Did you clerk for any law firms while you were in law school?
I did. I worked for Finkelstein and Kern. It was Judge H.T. Kern and Leon Steinberg. They were active. They were commercial lawyers, really. They did bankruptcy, insolvencies, and they were involved in liquidating businesses. And I was a clerk who would go out and inventory an estate of a bankrupt. I'd go collect bills. You know, the accounts receivable and things like that. We'd go collect them. That's the kind of work I did in law school.
Overall, what is your assessment of the value of your law school curriculum?
Well, it made me a good living and provided me an opportunity to do an awful lot of things. I think you'll get as good a legal education at the University of Tennessee as you will anywhere. And I can't think of many things of much more value than a legal education.
Now let's focus on your family, Don. I understand that your spouse is recently deceased, but could you relate for us her name, where she was from, and how you got to know her?
Well, my wife was Priscilla Doris Stansberry. She was Miss Knoxville in 1958, I guess, and I was recruited to see if she could be inveigled into helping the ATOs with their rush program, I guess in 58 or 59. And fortunately, I was able to do that. And even more fortunately, I was able to persuade her to go out with me some and finally marry me. And we were married 6 years when she died.
Could you relate for us, please, the names of your children, their occupations, and what they are doing now?
Well, Don the Third is our son. Don was born in 1963. He's a graduate of the UT Law School. He practiced law, I think, for most of one morning and part of an afternoon. And then he went off to fly airplanes, and he now manages airplanes for various owners and flies them and has a fairly nice business doing that. My daughter Deborah is married to Eric Ferris. Debbie's a dentist. She graduated from the UT Dental School. She and her husband have retired. I'm not sure how they manage that, but I'm not retired, but they are. Fortunately, my son and daughter both live in Huntsville.
And could you tell us the names of your grandchildren and what they are doing currently?
This is a test of my senility, I suppose. My first grandson is Frank Stansberry. He's Don's son. His sister is Lisa Stansberry. That would be Don's daughter. And Jay Ferris is Debbie and Eric's son.
And what are they doing?
Well, Frank is an artist, I suppose. He makes glass jewelry and things. Lisa's a graduate of the University of North Carolina in economics and went back to school to learn to be a land surveyor. She wanted to work outdoors, and she's about to become a land surveyor. Jay is still a college student, a senior at Elon College in North Carolina. He's a musician and a fairly accomplished one.
Do you think any of your grandchildren might become lawyers?
Don't see that happening, although you never know.
Would you recommend the law as a career to your children or grandchildren?
You know, I would recommend the career I've had to anyone. I've enjoyed what I've done. The legal area was certainly what I wanted to do. I think legal education probably is a benefit to whatever you really want to do. The practice of law today is kind of interesting. I'm not sure I'd want to work for a huge law firm today. I don't think I'd encourage them to do that. But if they wanted to be a lawyer, I'd certainly be happy that they did that.
Now let's focus on your law career. When did you take the bar exam, and what was your reaction to the exam?
Well, I took the bar exam. Let's see, I graduated in '62, but I think they didn't offer the bar until like January or February of '63, so that's when I would have taken it. My reaction was relief when it was over. Back then, you know, you didn't know if you passed or not. It just literally came out in the Sunday newspaper about a month later, and you go down and look at the paper and see if you can find your name. It's a long list, and it's sure a relief when you find your name. But that was how I did that.
Did you immediately begin searching for a job after your graduation from law school?
Well, I didn't really. I just kept on working for Finkelstein and Kern. They gave me some additional responsibility when I got my license to practice. I did some bankruptcy work. But, there weren't a lot of recruiters. The law school wasn't full of people looking for employees. The FBI was there. In a lot of ways, I probably should have taken a job with them. They paid well, and by then I could certainly use some money. I had one child and another expected, so I needed to be doing something, but I kind of didn't want to do that, so I hung on to what I was doing. And life changed when Bob Worthington came in one day and asked me if I'd be interested in a job in Huntsville.
Well, tell us, how in the world you started practicing law in the center of the universe, otherwise known as Huntsville, Tennessee?
Well, that's back to Worthington. A couple of ways I'd known Bob. He defended some people I was collecting bills from, so I got engaged with him that way. He was a campaign worker for Ross Bass, who ran for the Democratic nomination in '64 after Estes Kefauver had died. And a friend of mine from law school or from college really was working in the primary for a candidate from Newport named M.M. Bullard. And he asked me to do some chores for him, and I did. That's where I met Bob. And Bob came to my office one day and actually wanted to know if I'd be interested in the nomination to be an assistant U.S. attorney, and I didn't really have much interest in that. And as he was leaving, as a throwaway, he said, well, Howard and I are trying to find somebody for our office in Huntsville. Would you be interested in that? And I said, well, yeah, I might be interested in that. Next day or two, he took me to meet Howard Baker. And Howard Baker had the capacity to talk people into doing whatever he wanted them to do. And he certainly talked me into saying yes to that opportunity. And that's when what became my career really started, was when I went to work with Howard.
Had you ever been to Huntsville before?
Well, I had. It's kind of interesting that I'd been to Huntsville. Judge Kern had given me a set of accounts receivable from a bankrupt business and told me if I'd collect them on my own time and not on his time, I could just have whatever I got out of them. He'd bought them at a liquidation sale. And one of them was in Oneida. And I'd never been to Oneida. I thought it was close to Wartburg, but it's not. And so I drove up to Wartburg one day to court, and I got finished early. And I thought, well, by the time I get home, it'll be quitting time. So I took a little license with Judge Kern's admonition and drove up to Oneida and found this man who told me that my claim was twice what he owed, and he absolutely wasn't going to pay it till he got credit for the money he'd already paid. And I said, well, you look like an honest man. I think I'll just settle this if you'll pay me what you think you owe, which was $300, which is a month's pay back then. And so that was about a week before Bob came in. My reaction when Bob said he wanted someone for Huntsville was, gosh, there's a lot of money up there. That turned out not to be very accurate, but that was my only experience with Huntsville.
Tell us what it was like on your first day in the office in Huntsville.
Well, Actually, Chris and I had a baby due in January, and I went to work in the 1st of January. So we lived in Knoxville until Debbie was born. So the first time I ever went to Huntsville with the firm was Howard asked me if I'd like to go up there. He had a lawsuit to try, and would I just like to go with him? And I did. And that morning it had snowed 8 inches. And Howard and I drove to Huntsville in 8 inches of snow. Got to the office about 9:30. And we were getting a cup of coffee and settling in, getting ready to go over to Sessions Court. The phone rings, and it's Ted Q. Wilson up in Oneida. Said the snow was so bad he just couldn't get down to Huntsville. And would Howard mind if he put it off? And so my first day in Huntsville resulted in nothing happening. We hung around a while and went back home. But that was my very first day in that office.
Tell us what it was like practicing law in a small rural community where many people went to the courthouse as a form of entertainment.
Well, it was a great time to be a lawyer in Scott County and in Huntsville. It was a great time to have an association with and an employment by Howard Baker. You know, he was absolutely the most popular person in that area that certainly I ever discerned. The cases were interesting. We tried a lot of cases. We settled some, of course, but Howard had a wonderful law practice. He represented the railroad, the bank, the power company, the telephone company, the gas company, all pretty much any insurance company that was riding up there. I mean, he had a big book of business. And a big flooring mill up there was really a good client of ours. And so I had a wide variety of things to do. Howard had just an excellent reputation with everyone there. I remember going to the docket sounding when Howard announced he was going to run for the Senate. And I said, what are we going to do about our cases? We had a pretty busy docket. And Howard said, well, tell the bar that we'd like to have the March days, and then I won't take any days for the rest of the year. And trial days were precious because you really didn't get paid till you tried your lawsuit. So it was a good thing to have your cases set. I thought that was a pretty aggressive thing to ask the bar to give us all the trial days in March. But every lawyer said, fine, that'd be wonderful. The court said, well, of course we'll do that because Howard Baker wanted it. And so I think we had 5 or 6 trials that time. Howard didn't show up for any of them. I got Bob Crossley to help me once. I tried a couple, and I think one of them may have got settled, but we got through that term of court by ourselves. But it was a great place to be a lawyer.
Now, at that time, Senator Baker was just a practicing attorney.
He was a practicing lawyer, outstanding lawyer, really a good lawyer, and Howard was inclusive. You know, even as a senator or as just a friend. I mean, he's not a person who would come home and tell you what he did. He's a person who would ask you to go with him and do whatever he was going to do. And he gave me opportunities beyond anything you'd have ever thought you'd get a chance to do. But we tried several lawsuits together. He's just good. He really was. The courthouse would empty out to watch Howard, at the end of the day. They'd come in to see what he was going to do or say. He was a good teacher. I remember taking a deposition. He slipped me a question to ask, and I wrote on the bottom of it, what if he says no? And Howard wrote on the bottom, would you rather hear it here or later? I thought, well, that's a good point.
So you think Senator Baker was a good teacher as well as a good mentor, is that correct?
Oh, yeah. He really was, and he knew how to do almost it. Get a Gibson Suits in Chancery, and you'll find some of the forms are Howard H. Baker, Jr., Huntsville, Tennessee. I mean, they copied some of his documents for what was then the Bible of Chancery practice.
I guess to make the record clear, at that time, his father was a congressman, right?
At that time, his father had died. His father died in 1964. And if you'll recall, Howard ran for the Senate in 1964. And really the reason I was in Huntsville was, I think, Baker, Worthington, and Barnett had an office in Knoxville, but I'd say 60 to 70% of their practice was in Huntsville. And there were no lawyers in Huntsville. They were all in Knoxville. And Howard was getting some complaints about, people. He had his children in school in Knoxville, so he was down there except in the summer. And he was trying to put somebody in Huntsville. So that's kind of why they wanted me to live there. And so,
now, Huntsville, Tennessee is a huge metropolis of what, 500 people?
Well, one of the first things Howard asked me to do was to incorporate the town of Huntsville into a city. And I did that, and that required a census, which actually I did myself. And it was 386 people.
Wow. Could you tell us about some of your early cases that you tried yourself in Huntsville?
Well, let's see. Yeah. I was appointed. There was a doctor named D.T. Chambers out in Norma. You'll remember that one for sure. Doc Chambers had an interesting life and career, but by the time of his murder, he was in his 80s, I suppose. And 5 people showed up at his door, 3 of them, 2 men and one of their wives, knocked on his door. The woman claiming to be ill, she let him in, and they murdered him and robbed his house. Out in the car were 2 people that were charged, as were they, with murder. And Ted Q represented those 2, but when the first 3 got 99 years, I think the girl's father had hired Ted, and they decided maybe they needed a separate lawyer. So this case is a couple of years old. We got appointed to that. I'd never actually tried a serious murder case in my life. And we spent about 6 months learning how to do that. Fortunately, the state's proof fell apart, and I think we got him off with 11 months and 29 days or something. He'd been in jail for 5 years, so he got to come home with us that night. And so that was one of my more noteworthy matters. The next term of court, we decided we were such good criminal lawyers, we ought to take some cases for money. So we had about 3 murder cases that week, and we took those. And I got weary of dealing with criminals, and I never did take a lot more criminal work if I could avoid it.
What about some of your early civil cases? Any of those stand out in your memory?
Yeah, I had a lawsuit for a young lady that was driving a Volkswagen Carmen Ghia that was in an accident in Cumberland County. And we sued the Volkswagen company for product deficiencies. It was defended by Jim Neal, who was a really well-known lawyer in Nashville and had been active in the Hoffa prosecution and the Nixon impeachment business. And Jim Neal was a real, Aubrey Harwell were as good lawyers as you'd find in Nashville. They were the other side of that. We managed to get a nice jury award. It was later overturned in the Sixth Circuit on some curious grounds, but it was a really adventurous, big deal trial. Clure Morton was the judge. He was, of course, from Knoxville, but was in Nashville, and that lasted a couple of weeks, and it was certainly the biggest trial of my life to that day. We had another couple of trials on that order. I defended several of the directors of the failed United American Bank against the lawsuits by FDIC. We were able to work those out for terms that people could stand, and those were significant matters. The butcher banks gave rise to lots of civil litigation. I had 3 or 4 trials of some of the banks didn't close. We represented those against various butcher cronies that had business with them. And we tried some of those cases here.
Don, you explained a moment ago that a lot of the legal activities in Scott County took place during a, quote, term, close quote, of court. What exactly is a term of court?
Well, I don't know that they're still organized this way, but once upon a time, you had terms of court. The circuit court had a term that began, if I'm not mistaken, in March. You had another term that began in July and one that began in October, and it was typically a week. And that brings me to another subject. Right after I became a lawyer, we had a massive change in the practice of law over the whole state. When I started, we had what we call common law pleading and common law proof. And you could file a lawsuit by just taking out a summons. I hereby summons Tommy Phillips to court to answer for a tort or or something like that. Then you had to file your declaration on the first day of the term. That would be Monday. Then the answer was due on Wednesday. I mean, the whole thing went by terms of court. It was really a hark back to the days when the judge, came to town, and on the first day of the term he'd get all the pleadings, and by midweek he had all the answers, and he'd typically try the cases that came up the previous term while he was there, and things worked on that schedule. Now, by the time I started, the judges would occasionally give you some days outside of your term if they had a county that didn't have many cases. If they had some trial days, they'd give you some. Trial days were precious. If you didn't get your case tried, you didn't get paid, typically. So we all wanted to try our cases. But, Chancery Court, back then you couldn't put on an oral witness in Chancery Court without permission from the court. You had to file your pleadings or your depositions. And I've stood up in court and read depositions to a judge. Hopefully he was awake. You're just standing there reading to him. It was pretty easy to get permission to put on an oral witness because most judges didn't want to sit there and listen to lawyers read. But that was a massive change in the way the world worked. Common law pleading was taken over by code pleading and rules of evidence and the procedure.
Well, I'm sure that you encountered a lot of what we would consider to be characters in your early practice of law. Can you tell us something about some of those early older lawyers?
The problem with character, well, the lawyers I can talk about. The problem with the characters is in a small town, if you describe them for very long, everybody will know who you're talking about. So. But we had a really good bar, very interesting people. I mentioned Ted Q. Wilson earlier. Ted was the guy that founded the Southern Labor Union, for goodness sakes. I mean, his office was blown up, we always thought, at least he thought, by the United Mine Workers. I don't know who blew it up, but they took a stick of dynamite and blew the corner out of his office. Ted was in all sorts of labor matters. He was a frequent plaintiff's lawyer in civil matters, so I had a host of cases with and against Ted. We had, Maxwell Sexton and Guy Jefferson, Charlie Martin, and just a whole host of interesting people to try lawsuits against. And we tried them. I mean, there was some settlements, but mostly you just tried lawsuits and did a lot of it.
Now, Huntsville is a little distance from Knoxville. Is that, 50 miles from Knoxville?
It's probably 50 miles. It's back in the days we're talking about, it was an hour and a half to 2 hours as hard as you could drive. Today, it's a pretty comfortable hour. The difference being I-75 and New 63. In fact, someone said they wished Howard Baker had been born in Winfield. Maybe the road would have gone all the way up there. But nowadays, it's not such a big deal to come to Knoxville. It used to be quite a chore to come to Knoxville. And we came down here a lot. The railroad would make you take everything to federal court if you had any basis at all. And with the railroad, you pretty much always did. Most of the insurance companies would go to Knoxville if they could. And so we had a pretty active practice in the federal court here in Knoxville.
Yes, you became very active in the Knox County Bar as well as the Scott County Bar. How did that evolution take place?
Well, of course, I started out in the Knox County Bar, and I never really left. We always had an office here. When I moved to Huntsville, for 65 till 79, I guess, I primarily was working in Huntsville. And after 79, I primarily worked somewhere else, although I continued to live in Huntsville.
Would you relate for us, please, your specialty in the practice of law and how that developed?
I have no idea what my specialty was. The nice thing about being a lawyer is you can do a lot of different things and call yourself a lawyer. I started out mostly trying personal injury cases, plaintiff and defense. Later, just the way our firm evolved, we were primarily defense lawyers. I tried one of the early Jeep rollover cases, and that produced probably 20 years of litigation on behalf of Chrysler and American Motors for vehicles rolling over. Ford, we represented several manufacturers in on that issue. We became pretty known for rollover matters. In the Butcher days, we defended a lot of directors of different failed banks. I had quite a few cases of that order, and they lend themselves to somewhat specialization. The issues are pretty much the same in all of them.
How did your work in Huntsville compare with your work in Knox County and other metropolitan areas?
Well, you know, we had really good judges in Huntsville. My Davis was circuit judge, and I'd say any lawyers you ever met would rank him as some of the best that they ever saw. Knox County had good judges. Of course, in federal court, it was Robert L. Taylor, Judge Taylor.
And we'll talk about Judge Taylor in just a moment.
And you know, one thing you had to learn in those days was how to survive in that atmosphere, and so that was the federal judge. Although occasionally you'd get up to Judge Neese's court in Greenville.
When you had a jury trial in Scott County, wasn't it possible that the jurors would know the parties, the lawyers, and everyone involved?
They knew everybody. If you had to get everybody off the jury that knew anybody, you'd never get one. I did a medical malpractice case up there. I think one time Dr. Milford was a defendant, George Klein was a defendant, and the hospital was a defendant. We went through 60 or 70 people before we found anybody who didn't say they already knew what happened. I mean,
I think I assisted you in that trial.
I think you were in that one. Like, I remember Dr. Thompson saying, "Am I going to be tried with the only 12 people in the county that don't know me?" He said, I don't think they'd be smart enough to be a juror.
While you were in practice in Huntsville, were you active in the local bar, bench and bar activities?
I think I was the president of Scott County Bar for a long time. We've never been that active as a bar association, but we tried our best to stay in touch on matters of general interest. As I say, the big deal then was getting your case tried, and we talked Judge Davis into letting us put divorce day off with a special judge one time, so we wouldn't waste a day on divorces. We talked the judges into letting us set the docket ahead of the term of court, so you're going to waste Monday if you're not careful, because there's nothing said. And so they let us. We were successful in getting their cooperation in setting dockets in advance, so you could get all the trials in you could. So that's kind of the work we did.
How many lawyers were in Scott County when you first started practicing?
Well, there was Ted Narzo, John Lee West, Maxwell Sexton, Charlie Martin, Bob Beatty and Charlie Sexton came shortly after I got there. So I'd say 9 or 10.
And how many would be practicing there today?
I'd say about half of them.
How do you compare the practice as it was when you started practicing and the practice in Scott County today?
Well, I guess I should preface that answer by, disclaiming a great deal of knowledge other than just casual knowledge of what they're doing today. But my impression is that everybody, if it weren't for crime, they'd all starve to death. About half the people are prosecuting crime, the other half are defending it. And that's pretty much the main thrust of the bar. There's a few business lawyers. We used to pretty much do everything. You don't see a lot of trials anymore. I'm not sure it's the same atmosphere and opportunity that I had when I got there.
If you would, Don, relate for us the changes in office technology that you experienced from the days when your secretary typed your pleadings with carbon paper until the development of computers and automated technology.
Well, I was blessed when I went to Huntsville. Howard Baker had a secretary named Tommy Lee Jeffers, who was an outstanding shorthand secretary who had a variety of office skills and was just very good. And she actually knew a lot more about what was going on than I did, and I was very fortunate in that respect. There were no Xerox machines. One of Tommy Lee's many skills was she had a machine with a giant light bulb, and a bath of chemicals that you could put a piece of paper on and somehow get a negative and draw it through a thing like a washing machine wringer. And if you ran it through twice, you could get 2 copies, and you couldn't read either of them. But that was the only thing we had for a copy machine. Everything was original in 6, and if you needed more than 6 copies, you were just dead out of luck. You had to get by with what you had. Today, of course, you can you can have as many copies of anything as you want.
What do you think about the increasing use of paralegals and legal assistants in our profession?
I think that's a good development. An awful lot of what a lawyer does is something you can train others to do. I think you need to, you need the professional judgment of a lawyer before it finally becomes a product. But you can get an awful lot done by a person that just simply knows how to do what it is they've been trained to do. I mentioned Tommy Lee. I lost some case and was appealing it back when the procedure was to have a bill of exceptions. And you have some deadline to file that. I was up against it, sort of, not tight, but it was getting close, and I was increasingly inquisitive about when we're going to get this finished. And a bit impatiently one day I said, well, when are we going to get it finished? And she said, well, you need to understand that Mr. Baker won his cases. I don't have a great deal of experience in appealing these things. So I eventually got my bill of exceptions.
Don, do you consider the Tennessee State Bar Association to have been a good influence on your career?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, the bar furnishes services to lawyers. I never was particularly active in the bar. I've always belonged. I've always supported it. I never was a big guy to attend a lot of bar association meetings, but I did take advantage of the services they offer, and they are considerable.
Let's talk for a few minutes about your association with your old law firm, Baker, Worthington, Crosley, and Stansberry. You were a partner in that firm, is that correct?
I went to work for what was then Baker, Worthington, and Barnett in January of 1965. I became a partner in that firm in September of 1965, which gives you some idea of the value they place on having a lawyer in Huntsville. I guess my name got put on there when Barnett left, and he went to work for Governor Winfield Dunn, and it became, and by then Bob Crosley had joined us, so it was Baker, Worthington, Crosley, and Stansberry. And I was like the 4th guy in that door when I left. I think we had over 250 lawyers. And I think there's 600 of them now. It's just a huge firm.
Do you recall what your starting salary was when you began with Baker Worthington?
$500 a month, which was a substantial increase over what I made in Knoxville.
Do you think that the enlargement of the firm was a good thing?
Well, I think so. We certainly did at the time because we did it intentionally. Back when we all put our names on the letterhead, you'll recall, Bob Crosley sent me a piece of stationery one day with a line about 8 or 9 names down. Says, I think in this area we started adding too many people. But, you know, the kinds of litigation you're handling, the kind of transactional matters you handle, some of which require a lot of people. The rollover work, it took a lot of lawyers to handle that. We had a big case of business and a lot of documents to deal with. You really can't really do that in a solo practice firm. So I think, yes, in that regard, I think that's a good thing. But I think it's a lot more fun to run that firm than to have been a young associate in it, probably.
How large was the firm when you left the firm, Don?
250 lawyers.
How did the growth of the firm affect the Huntsville office? Was it just in Knoxville, or did it increase the size of Huntsville?
At one time we had, I'm sitting up there trying to rent an almost empty office building these days, but I think at one time we had 20, 23 people working in there. I had the entire rollover operation up there. We had most of the bank operation up there. Huntsville was a very good place. We had really good lawyers in Huntsville, and it was just a good place to get serious work done.
You mentioned a moment ago some of your experiences before judges in the Scott County area. Would you relate for us their names that you can recall?
William I. Davis was the circuit judge, and just really an outstanding judge. Judge A.G. Shoemate from over in Claiborne County was our chancellor. Those were our two basic judges. I mean, we had a sessions judge who was not a lawyer. It was an interesting place to try a lawsuit, but as he told me, I told you, I think at lunch, he said the only thing a sessions judge gets to decide is who files the appeal bond. And so he carried that obligation out very nicely. But those are our main judges. In Knoxville, you know, Judge Haynes was a well-known circuit judge. We had some work there. Judge Charles Dawson was the chancellor. Some work there. Most of, you know, the Knoxville trial work would be largely stuff that Bob Crosley would have handled in those days. I did some though. But those were the judges that were the most important in my practice in Huntsville.
Let's talk about the legendary Judge Robert Love Taylor. I know you had some experiences with him.
Well, we did. He asked me once if we had a circuit court in Scott County. Have they abolished it? And I said, well, no, I don't think so. He said, have you ever tried just using it? He said, you bring these things down here. And he said, we have to try these cases. These cases could be tried up there. Well, they could, I guess, if I didn't remove them, but I did. He was an interesting person. I always got along with him pretty well personally, but he was a force to deal with. I mean, he really was. I think we had a case in there once. It was a crossing accident at the Pemberton crossing there in Oneida. I think we put 13 witnesses and picked a jury before lunch. Now, you can't do that and get anything done. That one was sent back with the Sixth Circuit. But, you know, that's just a hard place to try a lawsuit. I went to the Sixth Circuit once on a case where no one had filed an answer. That's kind of hard to do. But you recall that if you filed more than 2 motions, he'd call a pretrial conference and supersede your pleadings with a pretrial order. And, you know, that's how that happened. But you're sitting in the Sixth Circuit. When you try to find the pleadings, there aren't any.
Can you remember any cases that particularly stand out in your memory that you tried before Judge Taylor?
Yes, I can. You can too. You remember the Scott County Hospital had a huge strike. And a young lady trying to go to the hospital had been turned away a couple of times. So on the last time she went, she just turned the corner about 30 miles an hour and knocked picketers everywhere with her car. And the radio station declared that this lady had taken her car as a lethal weapon charged through this picket line. So we sued them for slander, that lethal weapon was accusing her of a crime. Judge Taylor was nearly unhinged. He didn't see why on earth we would bring such a matter as that in his court. But we managed to prevail in that. He cut my judgment in half after on the motion for a new trial. I tried to put a witness up to prove that this slander had damaged this young lady's prospects for marriage. And that, again, brought a swift rebuke. I had Deacon Sexton, the county judge, as my expert on that subject. And he said, Judge Sexton does not know why anyone marries anyone. You do not know why anyone marries anyone. I do not know why anyone marries anyone. And this jury will never figure out why anyone marries anyone. Do not ask that question again. But
do you recall how much you recovered in that case?
We got $10,000 and he cut it to $5,000. I mean, we tried ordinary lawsuits once upon a time. Then the same strike provoked a suit against the directors of the bank, and we tried that for about a week. And that was an interesting case here.
And that was in federal court as well?
Oh, yeah. At the conclusion of that matter, which we won, I was packing up my bags and getting ready to go to the office. Crosley had helped me in that. And some of my clients came back upstairs and said, "We can't get out." Said the union's lined up at the door and they're threatening to hit us if we try to go out the door. I thought, well, this is going to be fun. So I called Biggie Marshall, who was the marshal. And I said, "Biggie, my clients they're being interfered with as they try to leave the courthouse." So he came back in a few minutes and I said, "Did you get them?" He said, "No, Don, I didn't. I just let them go." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, 3 of your clients were carrying a pistol. You got any idea what Judge Taylor's going to say when he finds that out?" I said, "Don't think I want him to find that out." I had no idea that was the case, but the directors of our hospital were not meant to be intimidated.
Don, you mentioned a few moments ago that in the course of your practice in Huntsville, you had encountered some, quote, characters, close quote. Can you tell us some more stories about those?
Well, Ted Q. Wilson was a character for sure. Ted and I had different sides of the same lawsuit. He'd sued somebody and drawn a cross action. I had the defense of the cross action. He had the plaintiff's case. We tried it all day, and the jury came back for both defendants, which means I won, but Ted didn't. I walked across the street to tell Howard how I'd done. I looked out the window, and Ted's client had a pocketbook, and she was beating him half to death as he came across the street. So he ran into the office and just opened the door and came in Howard's office and slammed it real quick, and we all looked out the window while this woman tried to see where Ted had gone. But Ted had a way of having interesting litigation. You and I participated in some of that. Charlie Martin was always a character. He was a person who had a lot of cases, filed a lot of cases. He wanted to try his case the day he filed it if he could. And he was a good lawyer. You've got an inquiry there.
Well, Don, we've been filming for quite a while. This is probably a good time for us to take a short break.
Why don't we do that?
Don, a moment ago, you related to us your experience with rollover cases. Could you give us more detail about how you got involved in that litigation and the significance of those cases?
Well, in the early 80s, 60 Minutes ran a program that I believe was sponsored by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety that declared the Jeep CJ5 to be a unreasonable risk to roll over at fairly low speeds. 60 Minutes had conducted a series of tests that would seem to indicate that the Jeep could be turned over at fairly low speeds. And there were a lot of Jeeps that had rolled over, we always thought very high speeds and under other extreme circumstances. But anyway, that prompted a lot of litigation. I mentioned Judge Taylor before. One of the advantages of the fact that he was determined to keep a clear docket was that if you filed a case in the Eastern District of Tennessee, there was a good chance you were going to try it within a year. If you filed a case in California, New York, Florida, you could be 4 or 5 years getting to trial. The result was that in East Tennessee, we frequently had the opportunity to try one of the first of these, what I'll call national cases. And that was my experience with the Jeep situation. There was a case filed, I think it came out of Roane County, filed here in Federal District Court. We tried it, and we got a successful defense verdict. And that produced an opportunity for me to participate in hundreds of other cases around the country involving that same general set of facts. In fact, I guess I was engaged and the firm was engaged in that work 10, 12 years. Went on for just forever. Other manufacturers, we had an opportunity to work for other manufacturers. American Motors was acquired by Chrysler, so we ended up doing Chrysler work. So that was one of the major things we did. And You asked me about the size of the office in Huntsville. We had people up there working on those cases. We had a big office full of lawyers and staff.
Let's talk for just a few minutes about the evolution of the firm of Baker, Worthington, Crosley, and Stansberry, which later became Baker Donaldson. Can you tell us how that came about?
Yeah, Baker, Worthington, Crosley, and Stansberry started evolving in 1965, I guess, when I went to work there. But we grew, and I'd say in the early 90s, we were probably 130 lawyers. We had a group of our lawyers here in Knoxville that decided they didn't wanted to practice by themselves, and they did, and that produced a overture by Louis Donaldson down in Memphis to Howard Baker to see if maybe we could put High School Donaldson and Baker Worthington together. And after some discussions, we did that. And that's obviously one of the better moves that either group ever made, because that's now a major regional law firm. I don't know, they've got 500 or 600 lawyers by now, I think. But when I left, we probably had 250. But that's how that came about.
And you were a member of the law firm of Baker Donaldson as well as the old firm.
Yes, I practiced with a merged firm for 3 years.
Now, in the interest of fair disclosure, I guess I should point out that I actually worked for you, and you hired me as a young associate with Baker, Worthington, Crosley, and Stansberry.
We did. You worked in the Huntsville office, and were very successful until you decided you pursue your affairs on your own. But we enjoyed having you there, and you did a good job for us.
Now, after you stopped practicing law, Don, you undertook other endeavors. Would you explain to us what you decided to do?
Well, in the early 70s, Senator Baker introduced us to a friend of his named John Rollins. John Rollins is a fairly well-known American industrialist. He and his brother, I think, had 7 or 8 New York Stock Exchange companies. John was from Wilmington, Delaware. Rollins Truck Leasing was one of his companies. Rollins Environmental, Dover Downs, Entertainment and Racetracks. Those are all John Rollins companies. But John joined us in buying a large tract of land there in Huntsville called the Brimstone property. Howard Baker initially was one of our partners, but he sold his interest to us pretty quickly because he really wasn't a person who wanted to mine coal or cut timber. He didn't approve of that much, so he sold his interest to Bill Swain and I, and Bob Worthington. And so that's where I met John Rollins. John had a huge property in Jamaica, and he got into some problems with the Jamaican government down there in the middle 80s, I guess, and he hired me to help with that, and I was able to negotiate a resolution of his problems in Jamaica. And after that, John just never kind of let me go. He kept giving me new chores to do and different things to do. I tried a lawsuit over in South Carolina that lasted about 3 or 4 weeks. And when that was over, John said, "What would it cost me for you never to do that again?" He says, "I've been trying to call you for 3 weeks. And I said, "Well, I've been trying a lawsuit." But I told him. He said, "That'll be fine." So I just retired from the law firm and started helping John with his projects in Jamaica. And he had a project there in Nashville. And John died a few years later, and his widow now owns all that. I still help her with her properties in Jamaica.
And can you tell us what your activities are on behalf of the Rollins Corporation?
Well, I guess the best description might be to work trouble. I mean, Jamaica's a place where my son once described flying a helicopter as standing on a beach ball. You could fall off in any direction. And working in Jamaica is like standing on a beach ball. You can fall off in any direction. So there's always some kind of problem down there, and I help with that. We own 2 golf courses. We have a wastewater plant and a potable water plant, a great house attraction, other attractions. And so the companies are very active businesses, and I help manage those, although I don't have a direct responsibility for anything. I just give advice and smile.
I think you still travel quite frequently to Jamaica, do you not?
I spend a lot of time in Jamaica. I go to Jamaica used to go every month. I now go probably every 6 or 8 weeks and spend about a week each time.
Do you enjoy Jamaica as a vacation destination?
Well, if I ever got to take a vacation, I would. Down there, most of you work when you go to Jamaica, but I like Jamaica. I enjoy Jamaicans. I like the work down there. It's a perfect climate. It's a great place to be. Got a nice house down there.
Is most of your work for the Rollins Corporation of a legal nature?
None of it's a legal nature. My deal with the Rollins was I would not be a lawyer, and if I needed one, they'd let me hire one. So I don't do any legal work for the Rollins.
But I take it that you do hire lawyers to represent the corporation in various activities.
I need one, I get one.
Okay. Would you consider returning to the practice of law?
Well, I might, but you probably couldn't get insured. I mean, the law has gone so far since I quit that I'm not sure I could get a case to court if my life depended on it. I'd probably get it dismissed for failure to comply with some electronic discovery provision or some other rule that no one knows about. So I wouldn't know how to do that.
Don, let's talk for a few minutes about your activities outside of your practice of law and your current work responsibilities. As Senator Baker's law partner and close friend, I know that you were very active in politics and actually took a year off to work for Senator Baker and his presidential campaign. Could you tell us about that?
Well, that's pretty much my involvement in politics. My job, Howard had a great capacity to compartmentalize almost anything. And while Howard had a great respect for my work at the law firm, he had a great respect for my work in business, I don't think he cared much for my views on politics. I think he once said if he'd listened to Bill Swain and he'd never gotten elected in anything. So I did take a year off the year he ran for president and worked mostly in administration in his office. That was a lot of fun, by the way. We didn't have a successful outcome, but everybody likes Howard Baker. They do in Washington just like they do in Huntsville. I mean, working with him was a pleasure. Just anyone you met was kindly disposed to do what he wanted done.
And what were your responsibilities while you were working in the headquarters?
Try to keep the expenses within the realms of the revenue. We were trying not to end up in great debt, and try to control what you could. I mean, there's very little you can control about a political campaign, but that was the job. I helped arrange the schedule, which probably was more of a disservice than it was a service. But I did work at that, since Howard would give me an appointment and wouldn't always see anybody else. So I did that. But we did that. But mostly my relationship with Howard was social and business. He and I, Bill Swain, have been in a lot of different businesses together. And Bill and I pretty much got the job of running the businesses.
You have mentioned Bill Swain on many occasions. Could you tell us who Bill Swain was?
Bill's a good friend of Howard's. I met him when I moved to Huntsville. He's a businessman who came to Scott County from Detroit. He's the only person I know of that ever had to have his minority removed by the court so he could buy a sawmill. Bill was a very young man when he came to Scott County, but he ended up staying the rest of his life. He ran this big lumber mill there in Helenwood. He and Howard and a doctor bought the bank, and Bill ended up running the bank. Bill was sort of the person who ran any business enterprise that Howard had much to do with. Bill always ran it. And I helped him. And he ran the Brimstone company, and I helped him with that. And
I believe he also was on the Federal Reserve Board, was he not?
Bill was on the Federal Reserve Board. He's had a lot of. He was really on the first state board of education. Lamar appointed him to that, and he's a very big advocate of education. Bill's a really great citizen. And he and Howard Baker together made a huge contribution to Scott County.
I believe Mr. Swain died a couple of years ago.
He died about a year after Howard did.
He and Senator Baker are both deceased.
They both died.
Okay. Now, Don, I believe you served as a member of the Board of Trustees of the University of Tennessee and served as the vice chair of the Board of Trustees on 2 different occasions, which really meant that you were the head of the Board of Trustees. Could you tell us what that was like?
Well, Governor Sundquist appointed me to the UT board, And that proved to be one of the most enjoyable and fulfilling projects I've taken on, other than the practice of law. University is a group of highly intelligent and capable people. They were fun to work with. The board was surprisingly good for political appointments. They really appoint good people to that board, and I enjoyed every single person I worked with. I was reappointed by Governor Bredesen, which I was very fortunate to be reappointed to another term by a Democratic governor, but I was. And I was vice chair on 2 different occasions, and had a real opportunity to work with the leadership of the university in all those capacities, and I really did enjoy it. And they made a lot of accomplishments in I was there 12 years, and I think things were considerably better when we left than when we got there.
Does the Board of Trustees get actively involved in the university policies?
Well, they set all of the policies. The challenge of a vice chair and any leadership is to sort of keep the board on policies as opposed to operations. If you're not careful, the boards will kind of drift toward running the place, and they really need to pick leadership and let leadership run the place. And our board was good to do that, and they did do that. And of course, the system is bigger than just the campus here at Knoxville. There's the medical school in Memphis, there's Chattanooga, there's Martin. And so there's a wide range of interests there that have to be balanced. Revenue's very tight. Well, for most of the time I was there, but the last couple of years, revenues had improved and money became a little more available so we could do a few more things. But for most of my tenure, it was a matter of trying to get as much as you could out of not many dollars.
What do you think about the state legislature's recent attempts to manage the university? Is that good or bad, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the legislature should do what I just described as the trustees doing. The legislature should pass budgets and make general allocations of the funds needed, and really trust the trustees and the leadership to run the university. University is a very different place than the state as a whole. You know, it's a place of ideas. You're always going to have students and faculty that have ideas that are out of the norm for the state, and it's just a delicate balance there. But you know, the people that are running the university know what they're doing, and I think you'd be wise to not micromanage that too much.
I guess that's another question that I have, Don, and that is the Board of Trustees expected to rubber stamp what the university proposes, or were they independently involved in running the university?
Very independent. In fact, one of the early, I guess, couple of years I was on the board, we revamped the governing structure of the board significantly. Committee chairs became the executive committee. The committee chairs were expected to drive the agendas in the different areas. You know, we have a chair of academic success. You got a chair of an audit. You have a chair of communication and outreach and so forth. Research. I was the chair of that a couple of times. And those people are expected to be responsible for and drive that agenda. Now, there's a lot of input from leadership of the university, but the board's pretty diligent in testing that and questioning that and driving that agenda where they want it to be. I'm proud of the board. I'm proud of the work they've done, and no, I don't think a rubber stamp would be a proper description of the boards that I served on.
Now, can you relate for us the years that you served on the Board of Trustees?
Well, let's see. I think I was Governor Sunquist's last appointment, so that would have been about 2002 to 2014, I guess. I was reappointed by Governor Bredesen, whatever, in about 2008, maybe.
As vice chair, were you elected by your fellow trustees or appointed?
Elected.
Elected. How much time did it take you to do the work of the
Took
as
a lot
vice chair of the Board of Trustees?
Vice chair is pretty busy. I mean, first of all, you're on every committee, and some of them meet what they call offline. A lot of the committees meet in conjunction with the board meetings, but others meet at different times. And you're on all of them, so you go to all of them. In addition to that, you've got responsibilities with just the leadership. I used to have lunch regularly with the president, the various chancellors. You spend a lot of time. You're a spokesman for the board. We like to have a unified voice, and so the vice chair typically is the spokesman for the board.
Don, you also serve as the director of the Baker Center for Public Policy. Can you tell us what that organization seeks to accomplish, and tell us about your service as a director of the center?
Well, I'm on the board. I got on the board of the Baker Center by giving Howard a phone call message one day at the law office, and he said, "We're having a board meeting of the Baker Center, and you ought to be on it, so sit down." And I did. And that's how I got on the board of the Baker Center. But I'm still on it. The Baker Center was established by the friends of Howard's and by Howard as a area of public policy. I guess its stated goal is to perpetuate the ideals of Senator Baker, those of civility, of the responsibility of governing, of the duty of a citizen legislator to not be a professional politician, but to serve the country and move on to do more ordinary things. The Baker Center has a beautiful edifice at the University of Tennessee. It's really part of the university. It's supported by the university. It has an endowment. And they support speaking programs, educational programs. They host an honor scholars program. The whole trick is to make people appreciate the ideals, I suppose, of Howard Baker. And I think they're doing a very good job with that.
Don, looking back over your legal career, what do you consider to be the rewards and advantages of your career?
Well, I don't know. It's the only career I've had, so it's the one I can relate to, I suppose. One of the nice things about being a lawyer is you can do a lot of different things under the auspices of being a lawyer. I mean, I've tried lawsuits in a country courthouse. I've done regulatory work before federal agencies. I've negotiated with foreign governments. I've tried lawsuits and managed lawsuits. My territory for American Motors was south of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi. I mean, it was a big area. I did the same sort of thing for the Rollins companies for a while. So you're all over the country finding lots of different types of practice and areas of practice. I've done some regulatory work. I've done a lot of business work. And all of that's part of being a lawyer. And I was fortunate enough that every 4 or 5 years somebody would come along. I mean, the bank litigation was truly unique. I mean, you had Jake and C.H. Butcher as officers of banks, that some which failed, some which didn't. The ones that didn't, you're suing Butcher cronies that are defense is that the butchers told me I never have to pay that. And that the man that's supposed to have said that's the president of your client at the time. I mean, those are unique issues and questions. In fact, you can read the transcripts of a couple of those here in this court, and they're pretty interesting. But that was interesting work, defending the directors of those banks, and I did that. I had quite a few of those. And there's businessmen who had absolutely no intention of supporting illegal activities, and all of a sudden they're thrown into that mix at risk of their personal fortunes. And that was a serious time. And I enjoyed working through those problems.
Don, do you think a multifaceted law career is still possible, or has that time passed?
Well, I don't know. It came naturally to me. I sort of attacked whatever came in the door on the morning I was there. I mean, if it showed up, we tried to do it and learn how to do it and get it done. I just don't know if we're so regimented now that if you get to do that or not. I know several lawyers that had a career similar to mine. They just done a wide range of things. I cut short my criminal work just because I just didn't really enjoy being with criminals. But except for that, we've sort of did about whatever came along. So I think, I guess for the right person, there are people still doing that. But I think the great big firms, that might be very difficult.
Do you recall any particular hardships and or pitfalls you experienced which influenced the direction of your legal career?
Well, I don't know. We had a hard time when the fellows decided to move out of the Knoxville office. We had the problem of too much real estate. We had to get rid of some office space, and that was disruptive. But we worked through it and got through it. That was hard. We always seem to have plenty of business. I mean, I'm sure others have the problem of not enough to do. Unfortunately, we really never did have that problem. We always had good work to do. My wife's grandmother used to always say, "Now, Don, are you getting regular work?" She'd always ask me that, and I was always able to say, "Well, yes, I'm getting regular work." But I'm not sure how to say, except, we just get along every day. Some years are better than others.
Okay, well, let's concentrate for just a moment on the present. What are you currently working on, and what have you yet to accomplish?
Well, let's see. I'm still engaged in Jamaica. That family is grown up. Their dad died in 2000. John had 3 wives and 9 children, and his widow has 4 children, and they're active in the Jamaican business. His will gave them that business. And those young people are in their early 30s now, so they're all very active in the business, and they're all getting started. I try to help them where I can. They're very smart, all college educated and capable people. And Jamaica's just a hard place to work. It's a very hard place to make any money. So that continues to be something I do on a regular basis. I'm an investor in and owner of 4 or 5 businesses, and I spend a lot of time with those, largely advisory. I don't actually run anything, but I enjoy doing that. The key to small business are your people. The ones that we really have good people in are doing well. The ones where you have marginal people, you're having problems with. It's just that simple. And I might have been smart to have learned all that a long time ago, but my first education was sort of funded by my parents. My second education was funded by my clients, and I'm funding this one. But I'm working on quite a few different things there. But I'm on the board of those companies and spend time fooling with them. I got called for jury duty in Scott County a couple of years ago, and didn't figure anybody'd ever let me sit on a jury, but by some magic, the court drew out 13 names for the grand jury, the last one to be the foreman, and somehow my name was the last name he drew. So I did that, and they liked that so well they made me the permanent foreman for a couple of years, so I do that. That's kind of interesting. And then I help my children with their businesses and properties and problems.
Well, I know you like to read. What are you reading now?
Well, I don't read anything at all anymore. I listen to books. My time to read is on the treadmill. It's in my car. If you decide to live in Huntsville, you have decided to spend a lot of time driving your car. Because with the exception of the bank in Brimstone, I don't have any business in Huntsville. Everything's somewhere else. And so I drive around a lot. And I love to listen to murder mysteries, legal thrillers. John Grissom's are particular favorites. Action heroes. But I just listen to books. And I walk in the mornings, and I walk on a treadmill, and I just listen to books. They're fun to do.
Well, do you intend to retire? And if so, what are you going to do in retirement?
Well, I've defined retirement as doing what you like to do and not doing things you don't like to do. And on that scale, I think I am retired. I do what I kind of like to do. My deal with the Rollins was I'll do whatever you get me to agree to do. And so I do that. And so I do pretty much what I enjoy doing now. And I don't know how you'd manage doing nothing. I'll go play golf once in a while, but it doesn't take much of that to persuade you that you were wise not to choose that career.
Don, what advice would you give young lawyers just starting their careers?
Well, besides, getting a good education, and I think it's real important that you begin your career with men of high integrity. I watched the Nixon situation, and of course we all condemned the things that went on there. But you wonder, if you'd been hired by the President of the United States right out of law school, would you have known to tell him you weren't going to do what he told you to do? I went to work for Howard Baker and Bob Worthington, who never asked me to do anything except the absolute right thing to do. And so by the time you've done that a while, you've got a little background. So I would encourage people to try to associate with people of high integrity. I'd encourage them to find something they like to do. I just don't think you're very good at anything if you're not happy with what you're doing. And there's being a lawyer gives you an opportunity to do a lot of things. You can go and practice. You can go to work for a company. You can start your own business. I just would really encourage them to be sure they like what they're doing.
How do you find those people of high integrity?
Well, I could claim to be smart, but I guess you're lucky. I just found myself working for some really quality people. You can tell. If you go to work for some guy and the first thing they want you to do is shave a couple of corners, I believe you might want to go somewhere else. It wouldn't take you long, I think. My example in the White House is probably a very extreme one. That would be a tough one, I think. If you're in the White House, it would be hard to question what you're being asked to do, although some things are so fundamental. Like even break in somebody's office at night shouldn't have been too hard to figure out you shouldn't have done that. But from there on, it kind of gets fuzzy. But, Howard Baker would not tell anybody anything that he wouldn't do. He tried when I was helping him with his scheduling. I recall one instance he asked me when he was going to go to some place in Alabama. There was no political reason to do that, but he had told this person he'd make a speech down there. And he asked me a couple of times when he was going. And finally one day he said, "Would you bring my calendar over here? I've got something I want to do." And I took his calendar over to his office, and he said, "I want you to go over to see Congressman so-and-so and tell him to pick any day on there he wants, and I'm going to go down and make this speech." I said, "Well, you've got a pretty busy calendar." He says, "Cancel whatever day he picks. I'm not going to tell a man I'm going to do something and not do it." And he left the Senate at 5:30 that evening, got back at 4:30 the next morning, made that speech. He just would not ever not do what he said he'd do.
Don, have you ever regretted spending your life in Huntsville rather than moving back to Knoxville?
Well, it's hard to regret what you don't know. I didn't. It is the life I chose. I certainly wasn't there for anything except my own decision to be there. Today, my children all live there. You can't hardly improve on that. That's a wonderful situation. I did have an apartment in Knoxville for a while and stayed down here some during the week. I don't recall ever spending a weekend here, though. So no, I don't have any regrets. I had a great career, great people. I don't think I'd trade it for anything I know about.
Is there anything else you wish that I had asked you that I have forgotten to ask?
I don't think there's much left for you to ask. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this program. I've enjoyed preparing to do this, and I've enjoyed being here for the last hour and a half or two, and I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I wish you best with this program. I think it's an important one.
Don, you've had a very varied and interesting career. Looking back over your career, did you make any decisions which you now regret? And would you do anything differently? It'd
be hard to regret the life I've had we didn't talk about it much, but you know, in the 70s and 80s, you could not believe Huntsville, Tennessee. We entertained, Howard Baker entertained, and all the rest of us participated with secretaries of state. The President Reagan came to Huntsville, spent a couple of days. We had dinner with the president and 20 people. We had senators, foreign dignitaries. We had a man from Oman that came in his private 737. My wife admired his camera and she gave it to him. Howard said, "For God's sakes, admire his airplane." I mean, the people that we saw next door were just unbelievable. And it's hard to regret that life.
And we had Ronald Reagan in the First Presbyterian Church of Huntsville, Tennessee.
He came to church and the Secret Service was in the choir. You know, Howard Baker was an inclusive person. I've said that before, but he would include you in just about anything that happened. Other people will tell you, you should have been there last week. We had, you know, Secretary of State Haig over, and we had this, we had that. And Howard didn't do that. He'd say, "We're having Secretary of State Haig come this weekend. You all come for dinner Saturday night. I want you to play tennis with us Saturday and Sunday." I mean, that's how that would go every time. And it was a great boon to those of us who were included in that.
Well, thank you very much, Don, for a very interesting and informative interview. This concludes the interview of Don C. Stansberry, Jr. This interview was conducted at the United States Courthouse in Knoxville, Tennessee on Monday, August the 28th, 2017, and the interview was conducted as a part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation.